The winter of 1944 settled over Germany like a heavy shroud, a gray pall over cities shattered by Allied bombers and towns burned by retreating armies. Across the Eastern Front, the Soviet tide pressed relentlessly westward. The Wehrmacht, once a symbol of invincible might, now staggered under the weight of attrition, exhaustion, and dwindling supplies. And in the heart of Berlin, Adolf Hitler stared at maps crowded with red arrows, each one marking territory lost, each one a testament to a war slipping through his fingers. But Hitler was a man of extremes, and his solutions would be no different. As the Third Reich faced collapse, he turned to the most desperate measures imaginable: the creation of the Strafe Battalion, penal battalions designed not for victory, but for death. Men labeled as criminals, deserters, political prisoners, or simply inconvenient soldiers were thrust into missions so dangerous, so suicidal, that survival was statistically improbable. In his mind, these suicide squads were both punishment and utility, expendable lives sent to hold lines, clear minefields, or assault enemy fortifications, while regular Wehrmacht units regrouped or retreated. According to historical records, the origins of these penal battalions date back to the early years of World War II. The German military, like other armies of the era, had long utilized disciplinary units to punish minor offenses. But by 1943, the scale and severity had reached a new dimension. The harsh campaigns in the East had decimated experienced troops, and Hitler's demand for unwavering loyalty collided with reality. The solution, in his mind, was simple and brutal. If a man could not obey, he would be forced to fight in the deadliest assignments possible. Life inside a Staff battalion was a descent into hell. Prisoners were stripped of rank, shaved bald, and issued weapons with minimal training. Uniforms were often mismatched, boots ill-fitting, and rations scarce. The units were sent to the front lines with little regard for their survival. Historical accounts describe battalion orders that read like death sentences, storming fortified positions under enemy fire, clearing minefields with bare hands, or serving as decoys to draw artillery fire. According to survivors, these men were sometimes armed with only pistols or a few grenades, their true mission to hold ground long enough for regular Wehrmacht units to advance or retreat. What happened next shocked both sides. In late 1944, Hitler ordered a series of Strafbattalion operations that would become infamous for their scale and devastation. Penal units were tasked with clearing minefields ahead of armored advances in East Prussia, storming fortified positions along the Oder River, and engaging Soviet tanks with insufficient weapons. Casualty rates were staggering. According to surviving records, some battalions suffered 80 to 90% losses within days of deployment. Commanders often remarked in reports that their units were practically expendable, a chilling acknowledgement of Hitler's philosophy in action. And yet, even as the world crumbled around them, these men were forced to perform. Letters smuggled home from soldiers describe frozen landscapes, shattered towns, and comrades falling with each step. The survivors spoke not only of physical exhaustion, but of a creeping sense of betrayal. They were soldiers, yes, but in the eyes of the Reich, they were also expendable, tools to be thrown into the furnace of total war. But the story of Strafbattalions was not limited to the Eastern Front. On the Western Front, as Allied forces pushed through France, Belgium, and into the Rhineland, penal units were similarly deployed. Here the missions were slightly different, clearing hedgerows, storming pillboxes, and acting as forward shields against advancing Allied infantry. The experience was no less harrowing. Soldiers were often killed within minutes of reaching the front lines, their deaths recorded only as killed in action in reports that ignored the punitive nature of their assignments. Inside these units, a brutal hierarchy emerged. Officers were often a mix of regular Wehrmacht veterans and SS functionaries, men whose duty was to enforce compliance and maintain the illusion of order. Discipline was absolute and favoritism rare. Yet human instinct persisted. Some soldiers, through sheer cunning or luck, survived repeated assignments, earning the grudging respect of their superiors and the fearful admiration of fellow prisoners. Their survival, however, was precarious, dependent as much on chance as skill. Meanwhile, civilians near Strafbattalion operations bore witness to the devastation. Villages along the Eastern Front reported columns of weary, unkempt men moving under strict supervision, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. Local populations sometimes offered food or shelter in secret, only to be punished if discovered. In many cases, these interactions revealed the complex moral landscape of war. The prisoners were both instruments of Nazi brutality and victims themselves, caught in a system that valued obedience over life. As winter gave way to spring, the role of Strafbattalions evolved further. Hitler, increasingly desperate, began incorporating political prisoners and even foreign nationals into penal units. The Reich's logic was unyielding. Expendable lives could be used to slow enemy advances, distract artillery, or serve as decoys in ambushes. The result was a relentless cycle of deployment, carnage, and replacement, a human conveyor belt of death, invisible in most official histories, but devastating in personal accounts. In Berlin, Hitler watched reports of success and failure alike. Success was measured in temporary gains, failure in losses he deemed acceptable. There was no room for empathy, no tolerance for weakness. The Strafbattalions embodied the most extreme manifestation of his ideology, obedience at all costs, even if it meant the systematic sacrifice of those forced to serve. And yet, amid this carefully constructed machinery of death, cracks began to appear. Soldiers in some units, weary of endless suicide missions, began to desert or surrender when possible. Some officers, haunted by the human cost, attempted to shield their men or mitigate the worst orders. These acts of quiet defiance were rare but illuminating. Even within Hitler's most extreme formations, human instinct for survival and morality persisted, often in ways that defied the Reich's intentions. But the war would not wait. The push into East Prussia, the desperate defenses along the Oder, and the encirclement of German cities demanded more from Strafbattalions than ever before. Each deployment became a test of endurance, courage, and human will against an enemy that outnumbered and outgunned them at every turn. And so, as the Reich stumbled toward its inevitable collapse, Hitler's suicide squads marched forward, men condemned not by their enemies alone, but by the very state they had sworn to serve. They were soldiers, prisoners, criminals, and victims all at once, forced to embody the darkest extremes of total war. The spring of 1945 dawned over a shattered Europe. Across the Eastern Front, the Soviet juggernaut pressed relentlessly into Germany, each village and city taken, leaving a trail of rubble and despair. In East Prussia, a region already scarred by years of conflict, Strafbattalions trudged through mud, snowmelt, and debris, their boots sinking into fields churned by artillery and tank tracks. Here, the men were more than soldiers. They were instruments of a cruel calculus, measured not by victories, but how many could be thrown into the inferno before the front lines gave way. Historical records indicate that these battalions were often under strength, with units numbering sometimes as few as 100 men, where full regiments had once marched. Their armaments were meager, outdated rifles, a few machine guns, and grenades rationed as if each were a precious commodity. Yet Hitler demanded that they hold positions against overwhelming Soviet forces, to buy time for the remnants of the Wehrmacht, or at least to die in a manner that seemed purposeful. The irony was chilling. Expendable, abandoned, yet still expected to fight with discipline and determination. The men themselves were a grim mosaic of humanity. Some were hardened criminals, sentenced for theft, assault, or desertion, their eyes dull with resignation. Others were political prisoners, swept up by the Reich's ideological purges, thrust into the same murderous missions as hardened soldiers. Still others were ordinary soldiers, whose errors in the field, too slow a march, a failed assault, had earned them a place in this unofficial graveyard. And woven among them were men whose only crime was bad luck. Caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, they were thrust into a war that demanded everything of them and promised nothing. Training, when it existed, was brutal and swift. According to memoirs from surviving members, officers drilled men relentlessly on storming fortified positions, crossing minefields, and reacting instantly to commands. Hesitation could be fatal, not only from the enemy, but from their own officers. Punishments were immediate. Those who faltered were shot in front of their comrades, a grim reminder that failure carried no leniency. Yet even in this nightmare, moments of humanity persisted. Soldiers shared rations, helped the wounded crawl from the battlefield, and whispered encouragements, small acts of defiance against the machinery of death. Meanwhile, the conditions at the front were as unforgiving as the orders they followed. Snow turned to mud, trenches filled with water, and frostbite claimed men before bullets could. Artillery barrages were relentless, and minefields littered every approach. One account from a surviving officer of a Straf battalion in East Prussia described an assault on a fortified Soviet position where men fell literally by the dozens in the first hour, their screams mingling with the roar of guns and explosions. We were ghosts marching into a storm. Every step forward was a dance with death, and the earth itself seemed to rise against us. Despite these horrors, Hitler's directives were clear. Straf battalions were not intended to win battles. They were intended to delay, to distract, to bleed the enemy while more reliable units maneuvered. In some operations, the men were instructed to create false advances, drawing artillery fire, or even to feign retreats, only to be mowed down by machine guns and mortars as the enemy pursued. Survival was not the goal, obedience and spectacle were. According to historical reports, casualty rates for these units frequently exceeded 80%, with some missions leaving entire battalions wiped out within days. But the human cost extended beyond the battlefield. Families of those consigned to penal units often received no word of their fate. Letters from home were censored, and the bureaucracy of the Reich ensured that records were incomplete or deliberately obscured. The men themselves became ghosts in the official histories, their sacrifices reduced to statistics, their deaths a footnote in the broader narrative of total war. Civilian witnesses spoke in hushed tones of ragged columns moving through villages, their eyes hollow, their movements mechanical. Some offered bread, shelter, or water. Others recoiled, fearful of punishment by the Nazi authorities. Among the officers, attitudes varied. Some enforced orders with cold efficiency, understanding the necessity in military terms, but feeling the weight of moral compromise. Others found ways, subtly, to shield their men from the worst excesses. One documented instance describes a commander in a penal battalion who intentionally misreported unit strength, saving dozens from what would have been an immediate death march. Yet such acts were rare and fraught with danger. Any perceived leniency could result in the officer's own execution. As the Soviet advance continued, the nature of Straf battalion missions became increasingly desperate. In late March 1945, units were deployed to the Oder River, tasked with defending key crossings under overwhelming enemy fire. Artillery and tanks rained down upon them, and many men were forced to wade through freezing waters while carrying heavy equipment. According to eyewitness testimony, officers encouraged the men with short, sharp orders, "For the fatherland, move forward." But the men, shivering and soaked, knew that forward meant death more often than victory. The psychological toll was immense. Men witnessed comrades die in unimaginable ways, swallowed by mud, crushed by tanks, or ripped apart by artillery. Some became numb, performing orders mechanically, suppressing terror in order to survive even a few more hours. Others broke completely, succumbing to hysteria, freezing in place, or fleeing into the chaos, only to be killed moments later. Diaries from this period recount moments of surreal horror. Men digging graves for their own battalion, scavenging the fallen for food, and whispering prayers to gods that seemed deaf to their suffering. Despite this, the Struff battalions performed as Hitler demanded. Even in near certain death, they delayed Soviet advances, allowed regular Wehrmacht units to retreat or regroup, and in rare instances inflicted temporary setbacks on their enemies. Military historians note that the impact of these penal units was tactical rather than strategic. They bought time at a staggering human cost, demonstrating both the cruelty of Nazi command and the resilience of those forced into impossible circumstances. Meanwhile, rumors of these suicide squads filtered into Allied intelligence. Soldiers on the front lines reported seeing ragged German formations, moving almost like automatons, their movements erratic yet strangely disciplined. Some Allied officers initially believed them to be elite shock troops. The reality was far darker. These men were not elite, they were expendable. Their cohesion, where it existed, was born out of shared terror rather than training or loyalty. By April, the situation in Germany had deteriorated beyond recognition. Berlin itself was surrounded, and penal units were pressed into the defense of the capital's outskirts. Strafe Battalion veterans described fighting in ruins where artillery and small arms fire were omnipresent, where every street, building, and cellar could be a death trap. Supplies were non-existent, ammunition limited, and medical support minimal. Men scavenged what they could from fallen comrades and abandoned depots, but it was never enough. Starvation and disease became as lethal as bullets. In one documented engagement, a Strafe battalion tasked with defending a bridgehead against Soviet tanks held their ground for nearly 3 days. According to surviving soldiers, only a handful of men emerged alive, many of them barely conscious, coated in mud and blood. Their success was measured not in territorial gain, but in the delay they imposed. A grim testament to the Reich's ruthless calculus. Death, if temporary, had a purpose. And yet, amid the horror, there were moments of profound humanity. Men formed bonds that transcended their grim circumstances, sharing stories of home, small comforts, and whispered reassurances. Letters and diaries reveal that even in the furnace of war, soldiers retained their dignity, humor, and will to survive. Some recounted small acts of defiance, hiding rations, caring for the wounded, or deliberately misreporting casualties to save comrades. These moments, fleeting though they were, illuminated the complexity of life inside the Strafe battalions, a mixture of terror, survival, and fleeting humanity in the face of systematic annihilation. But the larger machinery of war pressed on. As Allied and Soviet forces closed in, the very existence of these units became a moral and tactical paradox. They were both victims and instruments, punished for past actions while forced into missions designed to ensure their almost certain death. The brutality of this system, coupled with the relentless pressure of the advancing armies, created conditions that would define the endgame of the Third Reich: total collapse, chaos, and death on an unimaginable scale. By April 1945, the reality of the Third Reich's situation was undeniable. Berlin, once a proud heart of Nazi power, was now a city under siege, its streets crumbled and smoke-choked from relentless Soviet bombardments. Across Germany, the Wehrmacht was in retreat, command structures were fracturing, and morale had but evaporated. In this landscape of desperation, the Strafbataillons, Hitler's suicide squads, were thrown into the most desperate battles, often tasked with holding positions long abandoned by more reliable troops. They were the Reich's final buffer against total annihilation, yet for those within their ranks, survival was an almost accidental outcome. Historical records reveal that penal battalions at this stage of the war were a patchwork of survivors from earlier slaughtered units, newly drafted criminals, and political prisoners forced into obedience under threat of execution. Many were ill-equipped and exhausted, their uniforms tattered, their rifles worn, and their boots muddy and threadbare. Yet, even in such disarray, orders came down from above with ruthless clarity. Hold the line, delay the enemy, and die if necessary. Obedience was compulsory. Hesitation could result in immediate execution by their own officers. On the outskirts of Berlin, Strafbataillons were deployed to defend the city's outer districts. The men faced Soviet armor and artillery far superior to their own. One memoir describes a night in late April when a unit, barely numbering 70 men, was ordered to defend a partially destroyed bridge over the Spree River. They had no anti-tank weapons, only rifles, a handful of grenades, and a few Molotov cocktails improvised from gasoline. Soviet tanks approached with terrifying efficiency, and artillery fire turned the surrounding buildings into blazing infernos. In the darkness, the men huddled in trenches and ruined basements, waiting for orders, knowing that the first shots would signal near certain death for most of them. Yet despite the overwhelming odds, these men fought. Survivors recalled a mix of terror and grim determination, a need to prove that even expendable men could resist. Rifle fire echoed through the ruins, grenades were hurled at advancing tanks, and the shriek of artillery shells tore through the night. In some cases, entire squads were wiped out within minutes. In others, men survived hours through a combination of skill, luck, and sheer instinct. The casualties were staggering. In one recorded assault, only 5 of the 70 men remained alive by dawn, the rest dead or missing. Their achievement, measured not in victory, but in the delay they imposed, was a bitter testament to both their courage and the cruelty of their commanders. Meanwhile, morale among the officers varied. Some embraced their grim role with icy pragmatism, enforcing orders with a ferocity that mirrored the Nazi ideology. Others, secretly appalled by the futility of the missions, sought ways to spare their men. Diaries and letters from this period reveal accounts of officers falsifying reports of casualties, misdirecting units to less dangerous positions, or providing extra rations and medical care when possible. Such acts were risky. Disobedience could mean execution, but they offered fleeting glimpses of humanity amid the horror. In the streets of Berlin itself, the chaos was total. Strat battalions were not only facing the Soviet advance, but navigating a labyrinth of destroyed buildings, snipers, and collapsing infrastructure. Civilians caught in the crossfire often had little choice but to flee or hide. Witness accounts describe soldiers moving through debris-choked streets, shouting orders over the roar of artillery, dragging the wounded from collapsing buildings, and sometimes finding themselves confronted by panicked civilians or Hitler Youth conscripts equally terrified. The distinction between soldier and civilian blurred in these final days. It was during these final battles that the true purpose of the Strat battalions became painfully evident. They were expendable tools, intended to buy time, distract the enemy, and impose casualties even at the cost of their own lives. Historical analyses indicate that casualty rates in these final weeks often exceeded 90% in certain missions, with entire battalions wiped out in single engagements. One officer's report noted that of 150 men sent to defend a single sector of the city, only 7 survived the first day of combat. Yet the Nazis hailed such actions as proof of dedication and heroism, the propaganda machine spinning the sacrifice into a narrative of honor and duty. Amid this carnage, small acts of resilience persisted. Soldiers scavenged food from destroyed buildings, shared blankets with the wounded, and whispered words of encouragement to each other. Some wrote letters in the mud, hoping to reach families who would never receive them. These gestures, minute as they were, revealed the complexity of human endurance. Even when the system sought to crush them, these men retained the capacity for care, loyalty, and hope. As the Soviets pressed deeper into the city, the remaining Strat battalions were tasked with defensive operations in areas that were essentially symbolic: crossroads, bridges, and ruined factories. Their orders were clear: fight to the last man. One unit was recorded defending a small factory district for 3 days against overwhelming enemy forces, improvising barricades from rubble and scavenged debris. Molotov cocktails, hastily assembled mines, and rifles were the only tools at their disposal. Despite heavy losses, their resistance allowed retreating Wehrmacht units to reorganize and civilians to flee, yet for the men themselves, survival remained improbable. Psychological strain in these final stages was immense. Many soldiers exhibited signs of extreme stress, shaking, muttering, hallucinations, and panic attacks. Officers described men standing in trenches, unable to fire their weapons, paralyzed by fear, or wandering aimlessly in ruins. Some succumbed to hopelessness, refusing orders, or attempting escape only to be executed or killed in the chaos. The brutality of the conditions tested not only physical endurance, but the very essence of human resilience. Even as Berlin teetered on the brink, rumors of Hitler's plans for last-ditch defense filtered through the ranks. Plans for a total stand, for fanatical resistance, or for desperate counterattacks added to the tension, though many soldiers no longer believed in any chance of victory. Historical accounts suggest that some penal units, once ordered into these final defensive positions, mutinied or surrendered en masse, realizing that further resistance was both futile and suicidal. Yet for others, fear of retribution, indoctrination, or a simple desire to survive propelled them forward into the final hellscape of the Reich. Meanwhile, the human cost extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Families and townsfolk witnessed columns of emaciated, ragged men moving through destroyed streets. Some civilians risked their lives to provide water, food, or shelter, while others turned away in fear. Letters discovered in post-war archives reveal civilians' horror at seeing young men, half-starved and shell-shocked, driven into combat as if already dead. For many, the Strafe battalions symbolized both the desperation of the Nazi regime and the tragic waste of human life. In these closing days, the line between heroism and futility blurred. Soldiers who survived days or even hours of combat against impossible odds were hailed as heroes in internal reports, yet their survival often depended as much on luck as skill. Some officers chronicled their men's deeds meticulously, while others recorded only numbers: how many sent into battle, how many returned. The human stories, individual acts of courage, terror, and despair, were largely lost in the bureaucracy of war. The culmination of this phase came in the final days of April 1945, as the Soviet forces closed on the Reichstag. Strafe battalions were ordered into the city's central districts, tasked with slowing the inevitable. Men moved through shattered streets, barricading themselves in ruined buildings, firing from windows, and engaging in close-quarters combat. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the metallic tang of blood. Ammunition ran low, reinforcements never arrived. Soldiers relied on sheer will, the instinct to survive another hour, and a grim sense of duty imposed by both ideology and fear of punishment. Despite the chaos, some units managed to hold positions for hours or even days, inflicting temporary setbacks on the advancing Soviets. Their efforts, however, could not alter the larger outcome. By May 1945, Berlin had fallen, the Third Reich collapsed, and the remaining Strafe battalions were either annihilated, captured, or scattered. Their existence, and the extraordinary human suffering endured within these units, became a stark symbol of the desperation and cruelty of Hitler's final months. Yet the legacy of the Strafe battalions did not end with the fall of Berlin. Survivors' testimonies, post-war trials, and historical research reveal both the horror they endured and the resilience they displayed. Penal units, while instruments of tyranny, were also comprised of men who endured unimaginable conditions, demonstrating that even in the most extreme environments, human courage and fragility coexist. As May 1945 arrived, the war in Europe drew to its grim conclusion. The Third Reich lay in ruins, its leadership either dead, captured, or in hiding, and the once feared Nazi war machine reduced to scattered, defeated fragments. For the men of the Strafe battalions, the end came not with fanfare, but with a mixture of relief, despair, and uncertainty. Those who survived the inferno of Berlin and other last stands were now faced with the reality of surrender, an ambiguous reprieve after months of unimaginable suffering. Historical records indicate that survival rates among penal units were staggeringly low. In some battalions, fewer than 10% of the original men lived to see May 1945. Those who remained were often emaciated, suffering from untreated wounds, disease, or psychological trauma. Accounts from Soviet and Allied forces describe the discovery of these soldiers, ragged, terrified, and often unable to speak coherently. One Red Army officer recalled entering a ruined Berlin street and encountering a group of men who had been trapped in a collapsed building for days. They emerged dazed, clutching rifles with no ammunition, scarcely aware that the battle had ended. The act of surrender itself was perilous. Strafe battalion men, even after surviving endless combat, were often treated with suspicion by advancing forces. Their association with the Nazi regime, combined with their brutalized appearance and exhausted condition, made them targets for interrogation, detention, and sometimes immediate execution. Yet for most, surrender offered a fragile chance at survival. The Allies, while often harsh, provided food, medical attention, and temporary shelter, small but crucial steps toward recovery for those who had endured months of starvation and constant danger. Among the prisoners, psychological trauma was widespread. Soldiers who had spent weeks or months in almost continuous combat often exhibited severe post-traumatic stress, a term not yet formally recognized in 1945, but evident in behaviors: nightmares, panic attacks, hypervigilance, and emotional numbness. Some men, having been forced into suicide missions and witnessing the death of comrades in horrific detail, became withdrawn or unable to reintegrate into civilian life. Letters and diaries recovered post-war reveal moments of fleeting hope, despairing reflections on the futility of their service, and haunting memories of comrades who perished for orders they never questioned. The penal battalions were also a microcosm of the moral complexity of wartime Germany. While the units were instruments of coercion and terror, the men themselves were not universally guilty of war crimes. Many had been convicted of minor offenses, political dissent, or even arbitrary charges designed to fill the ranks of expendable soldiers. Their experiences challenged simplistic notions of culpability. Some fought with a sense of duty, others out of fear, and still others simply to survive. Post-war trials and historical studies emphasize this nuance, demonstrating the blurred line between victim and perpetrator in the chaotic final months of the Reich. Meanwhile, civilians and local populations began to reckon with the aftermath. Cities like Berlin were littered with the bodies of soldiers and civilians alike, and entire neighborhoods lay in ashes. The arrival of Allied forces, while a relief, also exposed the horrific scale of the destruction and the human cost. Survivors of Strafe battalions often returned to towns where friends, family, and neighbors had perished or fled, adding layers of personal grief to their already traumatic experiences. One post-war memoir describes a former penal soldier walking through his hometown only to find it completely destroyed, the few remaining residents staring silently from the ruins, a reflection of the isolation felt by many survivors. For the Allies, the presence of penal soldiers posed complex questions. These men were combatants, yes, but they were also victims of an oppressive system. Historical records from U.S., British, and Soviet archives reveal debates over the treatment of such prisoners. While some advocated for strict accountability, others recognized that these soldiers had been thrust into roles designed to ensure their own death. In many cases, men were held briefly, interrogated, and then either repatriated to civilian life or sent to labor camps, depending on nationality and perceived culpability. Reintegration into post-war society was uneven and fraught with challenges. Many former Strafe Battalion soldiers struggled with employment, social stigma, and lingering trauma. Those who returned to Germany faced a devastated economy, ruined infrastructure, and communities that had been torn apart. Yet, amidst these challenges, some survivors rebuilt their lives, forming families, finding work, and attempting to reconcile their experiences with the realities of peacetime. Psychologists and historians note that these men often lived with a profound sense of survivor's guilt, haunted by the memory of comrades who had died in missions that seemed both meaningless and unavoidable. The historiography of the Strafe battalions also evolved over time. Early post-war narratives often painted them in broad strokes as fanatical Nazi enforcers or expendable killers, but more recent scholarship has sought to humanize their experiences, emphasizing the coercion, desperation, and moral ambiguity that defined their service. Books, academic papers, and survivor testimonies increasingly explore the psychological and social dimensions of their existence, highlighting the ways in which ideology, fear, and circumstance intersected to shape human behavior in extreme conditions. One striking aspect of these units was their internal culture. Diaries and letters revealed moments of camaraderie, dark humor, and fleeting hope. Soldiers wrote of sharing cigarettes and bread, exchanging small comforts, and even joking about the absurdity of their circumstances. Such humanizing details stand in stark contrast to the brutality of their missions, underscoring the duality of life within the penal battalions, a place of both unrelenting horror and fragile human resilience. The moral lessons of the Strafe battalions extend beyond their historical moment. They illuminate the dangers of dehumanization, the ethical perils of blind obedience, and the extraordinary human capacity for endurance under extreme duress. Modern historians argue that understanding these units provides insight not only into Nazi Germany, but into broader questions of warfare, authority, and human psychology. By examining the lives of men who were forced into suicide squads, we confront uncomfortable truths about the intersection of ideology, coercion, and survival. Even decades later, the legacy of the Strafe battalions resonates. Museums, memorials, and academic institutions preserve records and testimonies, ensuring that the world remembers both the cruelty of their deployment and the resilience of those who endured. Survivors' accounts serve as cautionary tales, reminders of what happens when a regime prioritizes ideology over human life, and the ways in which ordinary people can become instruments of extraordinary violence or remarkable endurance. In reflecting on the end of the war, one cannot separate the destruction of cities, the collapse of the military, and the fall of the Nazi regime from the human stories embedded within the chaos. Strafe battalions, often overshadowed in popular memory by larger units and iconic battles, represent the starkest extremes of sacrifice and exploitation. They were the Reich's expendable warriors, sent into the fire to delay defeat, and, in so doing, became living testaments to both the cruelty of authoritarian command and the enduring capacity for human survival. By the late 1940s, former penal soldiers had dispersed into civilian life. Some sought anonymity, never speaking of the war. Others documented their experiences in memoirs, diaries, or oral histories. Their stories, pieced together from archives, testimonies, and contemporary research, paint a vivid picture of human endurance and the complex moral landscape of a regime collapsing under the weight of its own ideology. The world they returned to was altered beyond recognition, but their experiences remained etched in memory, a stark reminder of the human cost of war and coercion. The years following World War II were a period of reckoning, not only for the nations that had fought, but for the individuals who had been caught in the machinery of the conflict. For the men of the Strafe battalions, the war's end did not mean a return to normalcy. It marked the beginning of a different kind of struggle. Having survived missions designed for death, they faced a society grappling with guilt, trauma, and reconstruction, while carrying memories that could never be erased. Post-war Germany, divided and devastated, was an environment both alien and hostile to these former penal soldiers. Many returned to towns flattened by bombing campaigns, where families had been torn apart, homes reduced to rubble, and neighbors either displaced or dead. The economy was in shambles, and opportunities for employment were scarce. Adding to these material hardships was the social stigma associated with their service. While they had been forced into some of the most dangerous roles in the Wehrmacht, society often viewed them through the lens of suspicion, associating them with the brutality and ideology of the Nazi regime. Historians note that the reintegration process was particularly challenging because the experiences of these men were almost unimaginable to civilians. Survivors of Strafe battalions bore witness to scenes of unparalleled carnage, had carried out orders that bordered on suicidal, and had been forced to navigate moral dilemmas that defied conventional judgment. Letters, diaries, and interviews conducted decades later reveal recurring themes: insomnia, nightmares, hypervigilance, and pervasive guilt. Many wrestled with the paradox of having survived when so many others perished, a psychological burden often referred to as survivor's guilt. Meanwhile, the broader narrative of the Strafe battalions began to emerge in historical scholarship. Early post-war literature largely ignored these units, focusing instead on the more prominent battles and high-ranking officers of the Third Reich. In part, this was due to the stigma surrounding penal soldiers. In part, it reflected a reluctance to confront the morally complex and deeply disturbing realities of Nazi military enforcement. But as archives were declassified and survivor testimonies surfaced, historians began to reconstruct the experiences of these men with increasing nuance. One striking revelation was the diversity of their backgrounds. While many had been convicted of criminal offenses, others had been political prisoners, deserters, or victims of arbitrary punitive measures. This challenged the simplistic narrative of the fanatical Nazi soldier and highlighted the coercive nature of the penal battalion system. Soldiers were not merely expendable cogs. They were human beings operating under extreme duress, forced into circumstances that tested the limits of endurance and morality. The legacy of the Strafe battalions also raised profound ethical questions. Military historians and ethicists debated the line between voluntary participation and coercion, between complicity and victimhood. Could a soldier carrying out a suicidal order under threat of punishment or death be held morally accountable in the same way as a willing combatant? Scholars point to the importance of context, noting that these men were subjected to a system designed to dehumanize and eliminate them if they failed to comply. Their stories forced a reconsideration of traditional ideas about obedience, responsibility, and the ethics of war. In parallel, the men themselves grappled with how to remember their past. Some chose silence, fearing judgment or misunderstanding. Others wrote memoirs detailing the harrowing wishes, the camaraderie forged in hell, and the moral compromises imposed upon them. In these writings, one can trace a tension between memory and forgetting, between the desire to bear witness and the instinct to suppress trauma. The human stories emerging from these texts provide a counterpoint to the impersonal statistics of wartime death and destruction. The broader historical impact of the Strafe battalions also extends to contemporary military studies. Scholars analyze these units to understand the psychology of coercion, the limits of human endurance, and the effects of extreme risk on decision-making. Lessons drawn from their experiences have informed modern understandings of military ethics, leadership, and the importance of mental health support for soldiers exposed to high-intensity combat situations. Meanwhile, the memory of these men became intertwined with the cultural reckoning of Germany's past. In the decades following the war, memorials, museums, and academic institutions sought to preserve the stories of all who had suffered under the Nazi regime, including the penal soldiers. Exhibitions in Berlin, Nuremberg, and other historical centers now feature documents, photographs, and personal accounts that illuminate the harsh realities of the Strafe battalions, ensuring that their experiences are not lost to history. These memorials serve as reminders not only of the human cost of war, but also of the dangers inherent in totalitarian systems that exploit fear and obedience. An particularly haunting aspect of their legacy lies in the moral gray zones they inhabited. While the world condemned Nazi atrocities, the experiences of Strafe battalion soldiers reveal a layer of complexity. Men coerced into violence, forced to survive at any cost, often stripped of choice, yet still human. Their stories challenge the binary narrative of perpetrator versus victim, showing instead a spectrum of experience shaped by coercion, ideology, and circumstance. By examining these realities, historians deepen our understanding of the human dimensions of war, the resilience, fragility, and ethical ambiguity that define the lives of those caught in extreme situations. Decades later, survivor testimonies continued to emerge, many recorded in oral history projects, documentaries, and academic interviews. These accounts offer invaluable insights: the fear of being sent into no man's land, the camaraderie that sustained them, the moments of absurdity or dark humor amidst horror, and the constant presence of death. One former soldier recalled walking through a bombed-out city, reflecting on how the orders that had once seemed absolute now appeared absurd and meaningless. These narratives bridge the gap between historical abstraction and lived human experience, reminding us that war is never solely about strategies and battles. It is about people, their suffering, and their choices under impossible circumstances. By the late 20th century, historical perspectives on Strafe battalions had matured. Researchers emphasized their dual nature as both victims and instruments of the Nazi state. Academic conferences, documentaries, and publications began to portray these men with nuance, highlighting the ethical dilemmas, psychological trauma, and extraordinary endurance that characterized their existence. Such scholarship not only honors their memory, but also provides crucial lessons for understanding coercion, obedience, and survival in situations of extreme danger. In the final analysis, the story of Hitler's suicide squads is a cautionary tale. It underscores the dangers of unchecked authority, the moral compromises demanded by totalitarian regimes, and the extraordinary capacity for human endurance. These men, forced into penal battalions, were pushed to the brink of death, yet many survived to bear witness to the collapse of the world that sought to destroy them. Their lives serve as a testament to both the cruelty of war and the resilience of the human spirit. As the world moved into the post-war era, the lessons of the Strafe battalions resonated beyond Germany. Military academies, psychological studies, and ethical analyses examined their experiences to better understand the complexities of coercion, obedience, and extreme risk. By studying these units, humanity gains insight not only into the horrors of one war, but also into the broader questions of how ordinary people respond when confronted with extraordinary circumstances. By the time the final months of World War II arrived, the Strafe battalions had become an almost ghostly presence on the front lines. Their missions, once calculated with cold precision by Nazi commanders, now resembled desperate attempts to stave off inevitable defeat. Entire divisions crumbled around them, and cities burned as Allied and Soviet forces pressed in from both east and west. For these men, survival was no longer a matter of discipline or duty, it was a matter of sheer instinct. In the ruins of Berlin, Leipzig, and Dresden, former penal soldiers trudged through rubble-strewn streets, sometimes still carrying weapons, sometimes merely scavenging for food and water. Historical records reveal that many had endured multiple suicide assignments, each one more dangerous than the last, only to find that the war's end did not bring relief, but another kind of uncertainty. They had survived the deliberate hazards of their battalions, only to confront the chaos of a nation in collapse, where former comrades, enemy soldiers, and civilians alike might pose unpredictable threats. For those captured by Allied forces, the experience was often surreal. Many Strafe Battalion veterans were treated as regular prisoners of war, their histories of coercion largely ignored in favor of standardized procedures. Interviews conducted decades later indicate that some men felt a complicated mixture of relief and alienation. Relief at having avoided death in battle, alienation at being judged not for the acts they were forced to perform, but for the mere fact of having been part of the Nazi military apparatus. These testimonies underscore the moral and psychological complexity of survival under coercion. One of the enduring legacies of the Strafe battalions lies in the lessons they impart about human behavior under extreme duress. Psychologists studying these soldiers highlight how coercion, fear, and survival instinct shaped their actions. Many who survived reported relying not on ideology or loyalty, but on practical problem-solving and the bonds formed with fellow soldiers. Camaraderie often became the only stabilizing force in an otherwise chaotic and deadly environment. Simple acts, a shared cigarette, a whispered joke, a gesture of assistance could mean the difference between life and death. Meanwhile, the larger world continued to grapple with the moral and historical ramifications of these units. Historians, ethicists, and military scholars debated the degree of accountability and complicity, recognizing the profound differences between voluntary engagement and forced service under lethal orders. The Strafe battalions became a case study in the complex interaction between power, obedience, and human endurance, a reminder that in war, morality is rarely black and white. The post-war period also brought cultural reflection. Documentaries, films, and literature began to explore the hidden stories of those caught in Nazi Germany's penal system. Memoirs of former Strafbattalion soldiers revealed their inner conflicts, the guilt of having survived when so many perished, the trauma of witnessing comrades die in missions that were explicitly designed for annihilation, and the struggle to reconcile personal survival with the broader horror of the war. These narratives, grounded in lived experience, humanized a group of soldiers who had previously existed only as statistical or administrative entries in military records. By the late 20th century, memorials, museums, and academic institutions made conscious efforts to include the stories of penal battalions in the broader historical narrative. Archives in Germany, Poland, and Russia opened to researchers, offering previously inaccessible accounts, orders, and reports. Oral history projects, in particular, became invaluable in capturing the raw and often painful memories of these men. One former soldier recounted a march through the snow toward a heavily defended Soviet position, knowing full well that the likelihood of survival was slim. Yet he survived and carried the memory of the frozen bodies alongside him for the rest of his life. Their stories also contribute to contemporary discussions of military ethics and the psychology of combat. Modern studies emphasize how extreme stress, coercion, and near-constant exposure to death can alter moral judgment and decision-making. The experiences of Strafbattalion soldiers provide a historical framework for understanding PTSD, moral injury, and the enduring psychological toll of warfare. Their ordeal is a reminder that the consequences of war extend far beyond the battlefield and long after the last shot is fired. As we look back on Hitler's suicide squads, we're confronted with a complex tapestry of human experience. Men stripped of choice, pushed to the brink of death, yet demonstrating resilience, ingenuity, and, at times, compassion. Their lives force us to reflect on the fragility of moral certainty in the face of survival, and the enduring capacity of humans to endure even the most unimaginable horrors. Ultimately, the story of the Strock battalions is not just a chapter in military history. It is a profound meditation on human endurance, the moral ambiguities of war, and the indelible marks left on those who lived through the most extreme circumstances. They were victims and survivors, instruments of a brutal regime and witnesses to its collapse. Their memory, preserved through scholarship, testimony, and reflection, serves as a stark reminder. History is made not only by the victors, but also by those who are forced to survive at the margins of its cruelty. In remembering them, we honor both the resilience and the tragedy of humanity. We acknowledge the lives caught between duty and survival, between coercion and choice, and we confront the uncomfortable truth that in war, the line between heroism and victimhood is often perilously thin. As the world moves forward, the legacy of the Strock battalions endures, not in glorification, but in remembrance, reflection, and the lessons they impart about the human capacity for endurance, the cost of coercion, and the moral complexities that define all wars.